What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over our next episode in the Platform Fighter and Super Smash Brothers tutorial series. So specifically today we're going over the next part of items. So far, let's put everything together for all of our items, and then we'll talk about where we're going. So far in the item mini-series within this tutorial, what we've been able to do is use instant items, or consumables, basically. So when you see an item on the ground, you can go over to it, use it, the item gets used instantly. We have different types, so you can assign different abilities or features to each. We will be covering more of those in other episodes for specific functionality that we can do. Then we also have weapons, if I could actually land where I need to, which is like this, where we actually attach it to our character's attach point, and we can go ahead and use them. Quite literally, you can use them, although, again, the functionality needs to be written for each individual item for us to actually do anything. We can also just standard attack with them. Okay. And then in the previous episode, we were able to drop our item. Just like that. Now, we don't have any sort of physics or gravity attached to it, but by pressing the grab button while we have an attached item, we can unequip it, and it goes back to the ground. Then, lastly, we were able to throw our item, but now we're going to do a little bit more with throw. We're going to do damage in relation to throw. We're going to do a little bit of rotational movement to make it a little bit more exciting. And we're going to do stopping when we hit a player. And lastly, item states. So we'll know what state the item is in. If it's spawning, if it's being picked up, if it's equipped, if it's being used to attack, if it's being thrown. We can use it for a lot of different things. So I had a little bug with my rotation that I wanted to fix. But you can see that I was able to throw my item. It collided with an enemy. It's still over here. And the enemy now has 10% damage. The item was actually rotating while it was thrown as well. I can throw it the other way, and it'll keep going forever. Again, it doesn't have gravity. We're doing a lot of this kind of just standard methods for how to do these things. We are going to clean it up a lot, give it gravity, give it bounce logic, give it other projectile components that basically any projectile would have, and we'll allow you to customize that for every single item. So just be aware that this is not final. Of course, there's a lot of cleaning up to do, but the important parts here are this: being able to equip the item like we were and throw it like we were. But this time it's going to do a little rotation, and when it collides with someone like an enemy, like it did here, then we are going to deal damage to the enemy. See, it has 10% now, and stop the item from rotating. Now, this is just part one of the throwing items section. I mean, I guess this is really part two of throwing items, but this is part one of the actual logic we're going to do for the specific items when being thrown. So for weapons and items that are thrown, we have a few things that we need to knock off of our checklist. We need to be able to throw it. It needs to be able to either perform an animation, or we can rotate it like we did. I did a very, very basic rotation technique. It'll only take us about 1 minute to get down. However, we will actually probably make a timeline or even an animation for it. It's also being thrown the wrong way, I realized, because it depends on the direction that we are facing. And we need to, when an enemy is hit by a thrown projectile, or excuse me, a thrown object or weapon, then the thrown item should either stop moving, or should bounce back off of them and go to the ground. We need to enable physics and gravity on them. So there's a lot we need to do. Today, we're just going to be focusing on the actual throwing, the states of the item, making sure it's always in the right state, and then the collision with the opponent and dealing the damage based on what the item is. Okay? So we have a lot to cover today. It's a lot of little things that are going to add up and going to really be important in the system as we continue to add to it. So we're going to start in our code today, and if you haven't watched any episode of this tutorial series, just so you are aware, getting there in the series. Still relatively new. We've got pretty far to go, but you can see how much progress we've actually made already in this short amount of time. All right, and if you want to check out the previous episode where we were able to throw the weapons and items, I'll link that right here in this top right iCard. And same here with the playlist. And then we'll get right into it. So let's actually start with the item itself. Let's go to base item.h, and I'm going to show you everything I've added. So previously, we had two enums in here for the type of the actual item and the direction that is being thrown, or basically the directions that it can be thrown. Now, the item state is new here, and basically what this is this keeps track of what the item is currently doing, or what state it's in. This is important because we could change logic based on what state it's in. So in this case, none is a default. Spawning would be, we haven't done spawning of items yet, but usually the items won't start in the stage unless maybe you're doing a challenge stage or something like that. So most likely these are going to spawn into the world. So we have a state for that. We have standard is what I've called it, which basically just means the default. It's going to be sitting on the ground, able to be picked up or used. Then you have equipped, which is for items or weapons when they are picked up by the character and the character is using them. Not using them, excuse me. The character is just walking around with them and has the ability to use them. Then we have the using state, which is when it is actually active. So if it's a weapon like a sword, it would be when the character is attacking. If it's something like a Pokeball, it could be basically the entire time that the Pokemon is active if you wanted. It could also just be when it is initially thrown or when it initially collides with the ground. Depends. You can use these states in several different ways depending on the projectile or item that you're dealing with. So I don't think these are like very specific states. These are just to help us and to know what logic the item is in. Then we have thrown. So throw could be multiple things. So some of the items in platform fighters are throwing items. You can have a throwing star. You could have an item like we talked about before with the Pokeball. But you can also just throw other items to get rid of them. So I can also throw a hammer. It may be a melee weapon, but I can also throw it. So thrown could be used for multiple cases here. I have collided. Now you could separate your collisions, but we do need to know when this object collides with something. So in our case today, we're going to determine when the thrown item collides with another player. However, you could also check if it collided with a wall and stop it. That way it doesn't phase through the wall. Then we have destroyed, which would be if you have an item that has limited use. A lot of items do either run out of time or run out of, you can only hit, so many times with it, and it can go to a destroyed state. You can add many more states. There are a lot of items in platform fighters, and so it's kind of hard to encompass all the logic with one enum. So you may need a few, you may need very specific logic on each one. You may need additional variables, but this is a pretty good base, I think, for all the items that we're going to be working on to start with. Now, I've also added a variable called state that is of that enum type. I made it blueprint read write and edit anywhere so we can access it in the blueprint. But there you go. And then I've also added a base throw damage variable to the base item itself. And I should actually make this part of the blueprint read write stuff as well, because we are going to actually use this in our formula. So make sure you add this right here, which is, again, it's a variable that holds the state of the item. So it'll hold one of those enum states. And then we have this right here, this base throw damage. This is important because the actual calculation, at least within the Smash Brothers, is that it's the speed of the thrown item, the base throw damage of the item, and then usually a modifier. And so that's how you calculate the damage that gets dealt when a thrown item collides with an enemy. So we do need a base throw damage in here. Okay, so you'll make these two new variables. we will define them in the constructor. Since this is the base item, and we should never really spawn a base item, we'll spawn a child, we can set everything to the default, so type and state can be set to none by default in the constructor, and then the base throw damage can be 0.0f, or basically just none at all. Alright, now let's go to our SSB template character, and we'll take a look at some of the logic that we have in here. So, if we scroll down, you'll notice that we have overlapped and equipped item. This is not new. This is what we did in the previous item episodes. This will become more important later because we will be able to either switch items or hit other items with that item. Like, for example, a good case I can think of is maybe you have a baseball bat and there is an explosive barrel. They can collide with each other, and it's important to know, if you can switch items without dropping another. I'm overlapping this one. I have this one equipped. So just keep that in mind. We're going to be using these today. Again, we already set them up, but really try and think about the difference between the two. And then you don't really need to set up anything else in the header file. The rest is going to be in the character CPP. So if we scroll down, we want to go to our basic attack logic. That's where we're going to start. So for our basic attack, let's think about this for a second. So basic attack is essentially our light attack. Our punch in Smash Bros. Would be like A. It's the simple attack for us. And what that does is if you're overlapping an item that will pick up the item, it will also attack using the basic attack of that item. And so in the previous episode, what we had done is we had this right here, where if there was an equipped item and we used the basic attack, then I had this comment above it, but we never filled anything out. Well, we're going to set up all of our item states right now, all the ones that we can. So if this is the case, if we're using our basic attack and we have an item, then we want to set the item state to be using. We're using that item. That's the whole point of it. There will be additional things here in the future, such as, there's a cooldown to when we can use it. So we can't just spam basic attack when we have an item and always set it to be using. But that's for things down the road. This is just basic prototyping, so we're going to set the state to be using. Now let's look at the other cases here. By the way, note that this is equipped item. We check if equipped item. Okay. And then else, if there's no equipped item, we check if there's an overlapped item. All right. And so if there's an overlapped item and we use the basic attack, then what we're actually doing is we're going to be equipping this item that we're overlapping with. Now, what we want to do there is we want to set the overlapped item, the state, to be equipped. We're updating it from standard to equipped. Then we want to set the owner of the item to be this. Remember we had use item before, and we passed in a character pointer? Well, I'm also setting the owner here. It's not required that you set the owner here, but setting the owner will allow us to, avoid collisions with ourselves. So in this case, when we throw an item, we don't want to collide with ourselves and deal damage. We only want to collide with others. And so setting the owner, I can easily check against the owner and determine, hey, this is me. I don't want to throw it at myself and hurt myself, so we'll ignore any damage. So, so far in the basic attack function, we've added this logic right here, as well as this logic right here. The rest of it is stuff we've already had. Now we can go down to our grab logic, because that's where our drop and throw is. So if we press the button to perform a grab and we don't have an equipped item, of course we would just try and perform an actual grab. But we're not worried about that yet because we haven't handled any of that yet. So right now we're worried about the item logic. So if we press grab and we do have an equipped item, then we were checking the character state to determine if we were moving right or left, or otherwise just basically sitting still. There are other cases, of course, like we could be jumping and things. Those are cases we'll handle at another point. So really right now all we're worried about is moving left or right and the standard not moving. So with that, what we were doing is we were calling throw item on the equipped item, and we were throwing it either to the left, to the right, or we were calling drop item, and we were just basically placing it down behind us, detaching it from the character. Additionally to this, we want to set our item state. Now, in either of the throw cases here, we want to set the equipped item state to be thrown. However, in the state of just dropping it, I set it back to standard. I didn't put anything for the drop state. We may want to make an enum for dropped as well, but for me, I just put it back to standard because standard basically means ready to be picked up and on the ground. And when I think of dropping, I do pretty much think of that. You can play a little animation, like, you know, tossing it behind your head or it spinning around behind you before it lands on the ground. There are things we can do with it to make it look nicer, but standard should be good enough as far as the state goes, at least for now. All right, then. And that's pretty much all we actually need to do as far as these states go. It is important to note those things, but the other ones we will either set in the blueprint or wait until another time. I'm going to relaunch this since I updated that one variable, and then I'll catch up with you. All right. And so with that, we can now go into our blueprints and take a look at some other things. So first things first, I'm going to open the files that I want. So I want to open base item BP. I'm going to open base weapon BP. I'm also going to open a specific weapon, in this case, like sword weapon BP. And so I can cover some of the changes we will need for the damage when throwing these items, and potentially while attacking with them as well, although hitboxes could be spawned to deal with that. All right. So let's look at base item BP. There is logic in here that we're going to need to add, but I'm not going to look at that part for now. Right now, I just want to go over the basic components we need to have. So in the previous episode, we had a mesh and a pickup collider. The pickup collider is basically the range in which you can pick up the item from. It's pretty simple, and it's not even required. You could do all this logic without one, but it just gives you a little bit more freedom. So we added it. I've also added a damage collider now. Now, this is on base item BP. Again, a wrapper class. You're never going to spawn a base item BP, so it doesn't really matter in this case. However, the damage collider should be, pretty fit up against what the weapon is. You can use it for collision and damage if you'd like, but you could also spawn a hitbox when performing an attack that does the logic that we want. We already have hitboxes working, and we have a lot more logic that we're going to add to hitboxes. So, just like in our fighting game tutorial series, there are many cases where we could do this a few different ways. We could do it with just pure collision. We could do a hitbox and then check the collision against that. We could do, a manual attack. Like, if we hit the opponent with this part of our character, then we can deal damage. There's a lot of specific ways we could handle this. For now, I'm going to kind of leave alone the attacking and things. We're just focusing on the throwing. And for that, I do want a damage collider. I'm not planning to spawn a hitbox for the collider when the item is thrown. I just want to have a collider that is the shape that we want it to be and moves with the item. And if that item collides with an opponent, we deal damage to them. So what you want to do for that is add a box collision component. You can add it wherever. Basically, just add it right next to your pickup collider, or even duplicate this and change the name and change the size if you want. Again, don't have to change it for the base item. You'll notice now that base weapon also has this. Again, this is a wrapper class. You don't have to actually change anything in base weapon. I just wanted to show you now this has a damage collider. But so do other items. Like the health pickup will have a damage collider. But worst case scenario, we just don't use it. If we don't want items to be able to damage enemies when thrown, or they can't be picked up, then it just doesn't get used, and that's okay. Okay. Now we have the sword weapon BP. Now this one is where this gets important, where we change it. So this is the pickup collider. It's bigger than the sword by quite a bit. Okay. And that's important to note because it being bigger than the sword allows us to pick it up from a little bit farther away. But the damage collider is a lot more refined. It's a lot closer to the edges of the sword. And honestly, it's still a little bit bigger and probably should be trimmed down. So we can actually trim it a little bit now. It's very simple to do. You can just modify the different scales of these things. Not going to worry about the Y because the Y is the depth, which is not needed. But there you go, something like that. So that's the damage collider. So if this collider collides with an opponent when being thrown, it will deal damage. And I think that's a pretty good size for it. Now we'll also want to set up all of our variables on these specific items. So like I'm in my sword weapon BP, I can pull up my class defaults here by clicking class defaults. We already were setting the type to be sword, and you can leave the state as none by default if you'd like, or you can set it to spawning or something, or standard for now since we're spawning it manually in the scene, but you can leave it as none. However, it should have a base throw damage. If we want it to deal damage at all when throwing it at an opponent, it will need it. So a good damage, I had it at 10 right now. That's honestly kind of low, I think, for throwing, but we're going to have a formula for it later. This is just the base damage, so we will put it at 10. Now, in the event graph, we don't do anything extra for this. This is still just the socket and all that stuff, so don't worry about that. We can close the sword weapon BP and the base weapon BP when we're done with that, because the rest of our logic is going to be available for all items. So we're going to do this logic on all items. So we have the logic to determine if we have an overlapped item or not. And then we had our drop item logic and our throw item logic. This is all pretty much going to be the same. However, what we are going to change is we are going to add a little bit of rotation to the item. Again, this is just for fun. It's not required, but this is one way you could rotate it. We'll clean it up in probably the next episode, but definitely one of the throwing item episodes that we have coming up. And we will make it to where it looks nicer. But if you'd like to get started with it and start using it, this is a rude method, but you could do it. All we have to do is add a rotating movement to our item. So you add component and you add rotating movement. And then here you go. So you have this rotating movement component and you can set default values on it. It actually has a default, I think, of 180. Yeah, 180 on the yaw, which we don't want that. So I just made them all 0. I have constrained to plane X. And I took away the plane constraint normals, just made it 1 because it's constrained to the X plane, so the normal for that is 1. Okay, and that's pretty much all you have to do on this rotation movement. Now what will happen is you can actually rotate this object by using this component. So you drag it in and you say set rotation rate. And there you go. So at this point, then all you have to do is set a specific rate. This is basically your speed. You'll want to do it on your X-axis more than anything. Rotation on the X is what's going to get you the spinny effect. And then I just put -360. Now you can see that this should probably be changed based on direction, because it would be thrown a different direction. It would spin a different direction. And also, you'll notice that this does say collision testing is not performed during movement of the rotating movement. So just so you're aware, it is a little bit of a weird component. It does have its uses, but we'll most likely be going to something like a timeline, or even just physically lerping and rotating. It's actually very simple to do. I just wanted to show you the rotation movement component and what you can do with it. We'll go into more depth in this in another episode. That's a simple way to get it going, though. All right. Here are the real things that we need to deal with today, which are the begin overlap of the damage collider, or basically once the damage collider on an item has collided with an object, we need to do all the logic to determine if it is an enemy that can take damage, or, you know, it could be an item that can take damage, whatever, and then shall we take damage for it? Then we also need to be able to stop our movement when the collision occurs, so we will make this stop projectile movement. So these are the two things we're focusing on now. Start with the top one, as we should. So we have on component begin overlap damage collider. The way you get this event is you click on the damage collider. You can scroll down to the bottom and select this one, on component begin overlap. Hit the little plus and it'll make it for you. Okay, now you'll have this node right here. We have to do the logic that we want to figure out if it's a player that we should damage. This could depend on what item you're using and if you're in teams or not, but let's not complicate things for now. We're basically going to just make sure that it's not the thrower, the person who threw the item, that we're colliding with, and if it isn't, then we'll deal damage. So you can check the collider against specific components if you like if you want to check against their hurt box, but you could also just check against the actor either way. In this case, I'm just checking against the actor. So I drag off of other actor. Other actor is the actor that the thrown item collided with. So we want to cast that to our SSB template character. Okay. I'll do it down below. You can follow along with this one, but these are the nodes. Cast the SSB template character, and then we drag off of this and say not equal to. So basically, we want to make sure that the character that we found is not equal to the owner of the object. Get owner. Then we drag that into a branch. Okay? So that's how we got to here so far. Then only if this is true that it is not equal to. So the item that was thrown is colliding with a player or a character that is not the owner, so not the person who threw it, which means it collided with an enemy. Then we need to go on to determine more logic. So let me move this down a little bit. All right. And so now what we want to check is make sure that the item is being thrown. We are just checking right here. This will fire if the component, the damage collider, began overlapping with an opponent, which would mean if you walked into your opponent, then they would take damage, which we don't probably want to do that. Most likely, and especially in this case, all we want to do is check for if the item was thrown. You could also do drops if you'd like, if you want the drop animation to perform a little bit of damage, which it might be able to. So the way we check to determine if it's thrown or dropped or whatever is we just grab our state variable that we made earlier and made blueprint read write. And then we just check. We can either do a switch statement if we have multiple cases that we want to use and determine the logic for. In my case, I really only have the thrown state, so I just do equal enum. And then I find the state that I want to use. So in this case, I pick thrown. And then we can do another branch off this. Okay. And so if it collides with a player or a character that is not the owner, and the item is currently in the thrown state, then we do the other logic. So I'm going to delete this stuff now because I think we're pretty much good. What we need to do is call take damage off of this object reference. So the casted item will have a take damage function. In this case, it's the function that we wrote. We have a take damage function right here. We did this, I believe, in episode 1. And so we're calling that function. You just drag off of this and call take damage. Now there is one thing I didn't do because you saw that it wasn't even blueprint read write, is I didn't actually pass in the item's base throw damage. So what we should do here is for the damage, we should get the base throw damage and we should pass it in. Okay. Then once the enemy has taken damage, we know that the thrown item has collided with an object, in this case a character, so we want to set our new state for the item to be collided. So it's very simple. We do get state. Actually, we do set state, excuse me. And then we just set it to the state we want, which is collided. All right. However, it will still continue to go through the player if we don't stop it. And at this point, let's assume we don't want it to go through players. We want it to stop when we hit a player. Then in that case, we need to make a new event. I call it stop projectile movement, but you could call it stop item movement or whatever. And what we're going to do is, so let's do this first. So add custom event is how I've done this, and I just called it stop item movement or stop projectile movement. I can't name them the same thing, that's why I called it something else, but you can call it whatever you want. I called it this, stop projectile movement. Immediately, so we don't forget, make sure you call it at the end of the above function right here. Okay, and once you're calling it, we need to fill out the logic that's going to be important to it. So we need to stop the actual velocity, and we also need to stop the rotation. I was forgetting to stop the rotation, so it's still spinning in place. But this is really easy to do. We just grab our projectile movement, and we call stop movement immediately. It's a built-in function, and it will stop all the velocity. As it says here, 0 is velocity, usually 0 is acceleration for components with acceleration. You do that, it'll stop moving, but it'll keep rotating. Then you take your rotating movement component, and then you just call set rotation rate on it again. But then you leave everything at 0 as opposed to giving it a value. That way it'll rotate at a rate of 0. Basically, it won't rotate. Other minor fix with this, because I didn't actually pick up on this last time, with our projectile movement component that we added, it actually has a default velocity of 1 on the X. So over time, it will be moving slowly into the X axis. So it'll actually be coming closer to the screen or further away depending on what your map orientation is. And we don't want that. We want it to stay on the X. You could constrain it to the X and just not let it move. But also it just shouldn't have velocity at all at the start. So I just gave it a velocity of 0. Alright guys, and that's pretty much it for today's episode. We were able to accomplish quite a bit because having that item state will allow us to really control what's going on in the world. And we are able to drop and throw items. So in the next episode, there's a few things we're going to cover, mainly. And the first thing is going to be the gravity / bouncing when you drop these items and throw them. So, you know, it looks bad that they just stay in place and they don't stay on one axis. Like, even though we're only rotating on the X, you can see it's like spinning all sorts of different directions. You can actually constrain that with the rotating movement component, but really what we want to do is just stop it from being so hard-coded, and we want to allow some of the bouncing to be more natural and things like that. We'll basically set up a very small system that's going to allow us to have full control over what this looks like. So when we drop it, you know, gravity can be enabled, it can follow the floor, we can have it so it always stands upright if we want. We can do all sorts of different stuff with it. That'll be really useful to make our items actually look good. But you can see at the end of the day, we do have damage that we can deal by throwing these items. There's 10% damage by throwing it. Then I can pick it up and do it again. And that's what we wanted to accomplish today. So that's the next part of items done. And yeah, I look forward to the next ones. Items are a lot of fun, so I can't wait to continue with this. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership subscribers and my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for everything that you've done and all the support you continue to give me. I really appreciate it, and I'm really grateful to continue working on this series and have such kind support. If you ran into any issues while following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out and assist you with any problems that you could have had. And we'll get you settled and back on the right track. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.